In this episode, I'm going to talk about central planning, and I'm doing this for two channels. The first channel is the Brains and Bowls channel, and then the second channel is for the Effective Executive channel. So you'll be able to see it on either one. The reason I started to look at this whole central planning thing, I actually covered it in episode 27. And talked about centralization versus decentralization. And it's kind of along the same lines, but I want to put a little bit more meat on that bone if I can. And so when we think of terms of central planning, you typically will think about communism and socialism. And, you know, central planning is obviously huge in communism, socialism, because when nobody owns any property, private property, then everything's got to be controlled somewhere. And the issue is that everything begins with the scarcity of resources. We don't have unlimited resources to be able to do everything that we want. So in communism and socialism, you're basically going through and controlling those resources to what you believe needs where they need to be allocated to, and often even that they get wrong. So whether you're looking at an economy or an organization, and typically when I talk about organizations, and I've talked before about Dunbar's number of 150, where complexity starts to increase. That's where control can't really happen. Nothing wrong with planning, but control from the standpoint of central planning is the issue here. And over and over, you see both economies and organizations embrace this thinking, and over and over again, they fail at the economic and at the organizational level. Just can't have central planning for everything. There are too many moving parts the larger an organization gets. And that's why you have divisions and organizations, those types of things. But they can still happen. If you've got an organization of 500 people and you look at government, it's multiples of that. But if you look at an organization of 500 people, even central planning at that level, there's too many moving parts. And although I advocate understanding as much as you can about a system, there will always be something that is unplanned, or in simpler terms, unintended consequences of the actions that you do. And the problem with this is when you embrace this kind of central planning, is it often leads to not only waste, but also corruption kind of inside of organizations and economies. And, other than God, no one knows all that is needed to know for economies or organizations. There's just too much going on, too many moving parts, too many activities. But you want to learn as much as you can to make better decisions. So when governments through communism, socialism, and organizations control through power, members of those economies and of those organizations, they turn against each other. And the reason that happens is it's to gain that control of that power so that they can get the resources and make the decisions, associated with it. And they are very dysfunctional organizations as well as economies, and I'll illustrate that here in a minute. But they also you want to protect yourself in those economies and in those organizations from being victimized. That's why you play it safe, right? Something I've never done. So, pay to play Politics is kind of or politics in general becomes the norm inside of these economies and um, these organizations. So how do we see this in the real world? And let's make this really practical from economies all the way to organizations. And for economies, if we look at Russia in the Ukraine war right now, you know, tanks are supposed to have the Russian tanks are supposed to have this real thick armor, and what they're finding is that they don't. And attacks on them are much easier than what they anticipated because they didn't. The tanks when they were made didn't live up to those standards. People taking shortcuts, so corruption within the Russian government. The tanks are running out of fuel. When you centralize things, it's hard to do supply chains, and then they've also had expired rations. They've also had vehicles that have failed. So I mean, the list goes on and on. The whole Russian thing, even to recruiting, is a mess because of the corruption that exists in their existing system. Another example is the Fed trying to control the economy. Talk about something more sophisticated than almost anything is an economy and trying to control things through federal and limited control through federal funds rates and things like quantitative easing and now quantitative tightening. Got to get control, and the belief that a small group of people with big egos, by the way, and not even economists from that standpoint, and even if they were, there's so many differing philosophies and positions that people get married to a particular philosophy as opposed to looking and seeing actually what's happening in the economy. And so you're better off, many will say, to have free markets that are out there as opposed to somebody trying to control things. And I've obviously done another video on this for both of these channels. The fact that the Fed over controls. We can also look at the Biden administration, allocating the scarce resources to climate change. Now, wherever you stand on climate change, there's realities associated with it, and by advancing green technologies when we're not quite prepared to move away from fossil fuels, it's creating chaos within the system. And Republicans are the same way. With the Biden or with the Bush administration, you had Hank Paulson, embracing basically crony capitalism, to pick winners and losers after the great financial crisis in 2008, rather than allowing badly managed banks and companies to collapse. So, this type of control, you start to see the corruption, and then things get worse because they corrupted it. We're going to corrupt it even worse, in the economies. But the same thing plays out in organizations. They face many of the same outcomes with over control. You got people vying for political favor as opposed to working to make the organization better. And these things distract from what they should be focused on. So what should they be focused on? So the anecdote for economies, at least from my perspective, is capitalism, but not the way we front capitalism today, where you have the crony capitalism and you got, we're kind of in this, well, they did it, so we're going to do it type of thing. But we need to go back to the capitalism that is cleaner. And if your company fails, it fails. There's no too big to fail. You fail. And then the stockholders lose their money. That's the way it's supposed to work. But instead, we're saving companies and we're doing this. And look at all the jobs we saved, when in reality, they didn't really save jobs. They're still stuck in a bad system, poorly managed system in many cases, in favor of getting these resources that keeps something bad going and perpetuating itself over time. And that's not capitalism. That's crony capitalism. That's to some degree socialism. It's just not what we've always done. And again, I think it comes from the too big to fail, and we're going to save jobs. You're probably going to have more jobs if you have a more efficient system that can be competitive in a global marketplace. So just keep hanging on to a system that's broken is just bad business. It's bad capitalism. It's not capitalism. For organizations, it's to work from purpose and principles so that everybody understands what they're trying to achieve, and achievement of excellence and quality of their product, and with decisions embedded with knowledge rather than power. So in other words, a lot of times people say, well, I'm the vice president, so I'm going to make the decision on that. Well, do you have the knowledge? If they do, then okay. But often, very often, you need to either go get the knowledge, working with the people that are actually doing the work, because you need to understand how things operate. And typically at a vice president level of even a 500 or 300 employee organization, you're not going to have all the knowledge that you need. You need to work with the people that do. And oftentimes people then rely on support areas that don't have the knowledge either, the actual knowledge of what's happening in an organization, which is again why when I go through my working with organizations, you go through and look at the organization customer in. Nobody can argue with the way the customer is seeing it. You're getting real information, getting knowledge, and understanding how your system and organization works, not to gain more power, but to gain more knowledge. And otherwise, what you wind up, it's not micromanagement. It's not just saying, I said this, and now why aren't they doing it that way? And then when, the question more often should be, when somebody's not doing it the way you said, or the edict that you put down, the question should become, why aren't they doing that way? Because it didn't work. Or the perception is that it didn't work. And so without the knowledge being spread throughout the organization and only held in one small elite group of people, you wind up with dumb employees. You're just saying, you're dictated to all the time. This is what you're going to do. This is how you're going to do it. Here's the policy. Here's the rule. Here's the script. So that's to release from there. So, this is a really important thing for both economies and organizations. And if you want a huge competitive advantage today, I see more organizations turning to central planning with the smart people in the organization, either through power or perceived power, usually in support groups like finance or IT or HR. They don't have the knowledge. The people that have to operate the system on a daily basis have the knowledge of how that interaction works between customers and the organization. So that's what I wanted to cover this week. And remember, there is always a better way.